Havana, with the desire to support peace building from civil society through creating a culture of dialogue as part of what it means to build peace from civil society. And since 2012, we have expanded from a little group of individuals in London to having over 100 members, mostly volunteers in Colombia and the United Kingdom primarily, but also in the United States, in Canada, in Amsterdam, in Spain, and in Mexico. And what we do is we hold different kinds of spaces to engage in dialogue, primarily around the Colombian peace process from different aspects, but also on peace building and reconciliation more broadly. And we have various teams that follow different aspects of the Colombian peace process, such as the Transitional Justice Team, the Truth Commission team, the reincorporation of the FARC team. We also have a team that works on peace building and businesses, and a team doing work on peace pedagogy and peace education in schools. And we have a team here based in the UK called Embrace Dialogue Academia, which is the platform within Rodemos el Diálogo that brings together academics who are members of our organization, but also link up with academics around the world who are mostly working on different aspects of peace and conflict in Colombia, with the desire to hold dialogues where we can share knowledge and come together to brainstorm and think up ways of bridging academia with policy and creating a practical impact from our work. And we're really, really pleased as part of Embrace Dialogue Academia to have this new series convened by Andre, which broadens our gaze beyond Colombia and helps us to learn lessons from other case studies on critical dialogues on reconciliation, for which this is our third event. And so Andre will tell you more about that. He's going to speak also from the University of Winchester, but he's also a member of Rodemos el Diálogo. And you can find out more about Rodemos el Diálogo and the work that we do on our website, which I will post in the chat afterwards, and on our social media channels. But I wanted just to mention that we have 6 principles that we've discovered or come up with through the course of our 8 or 9 years now working on dialogue as a form of doing peace building in Colombia and bringing people together across difference to have dialogue. And we like to introduce these principles at the beginning of all our events to invite you all to surround the dialogue here, embracing those 6 principles. And the principles are, first of all, respect. And I think this is a very obvious but important one, respect for the points of view of the other. We might not all agree in academia and in peace building, but we can have respect for the person and their difference of opinion, even if we don't agree with their position. Solidarity is our second principle, which of course is a deeply important one, and we see it as our moral imperative to use our academic work to stand in solidarity with those who are suffering at the hands of violence, but also solidarity with each other and the peace building work that we do from different points around the world. The third principle is generosity. We're here to give the best of our time and the best of ourselves in this hour and a half that we're going to spend together. The fourth principle is honesty. We're going to embrace the idea that we don't have to be afraid to say what we genuinely think. Even if we disagree, we're going to say it respectfully and be able to express our differences of opinion without fear of being judged by others. The fifth principle is self-criticism. And I think this is especially important in academic spaces because we don't always have all the answers. And it's always an opportunity through a dialogue to revise our own opinions about things by encountering different opinions. And finally, the sixth principle is co-responsibility. As academics and as citizens, we very much see it as part of our work to support the efforts of peace building in Colombia and more widely across the world from whatever it is that we're doing and whatever area that we work on. So just also to bear in mind, as Andre mentioned at the beginning, in case anyone didn't hear it, this session is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube, and I will share the link in the channel in case you'd like to share it with your networks. So do please do that. But just bear in mind that we do encourage you to ask questions in person, as it were, by turning on your camera and your microphone when it comes to the Q&A section, which Andre will explain. But just to bear that in mind, and if you prefer not to be recorded, then perhaps ask your question in the chat instead. But we do encourage you, if you're happy with it, to ask it yourself so that our panelists can see the face of those that they are speaking to. So with that in mind, that's all from me. I'll hand over to Andre, and thank you all very much, and enjoy the dialogue.
Thanks, Gwen, and it's great to have everyone here. For us at the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, it is fantastic to partner with Embrace Dialogue. Not only your principles, but also the idea that the University of Winchester has as a guiding principle is really close to what Rodemos el Diálogo does in Colombia. Because one of the things that the University of Winchester strives for is to make a difference in the world by working with local and global community. And that's precisely what Embrace Dialogue is. And at the Center of Religion, Reconciliation and Peace, we try to be an example of the focus of the international work of the University of Winchester in peace and reconciliation, and the fight for integrity and justice in a world of compromises and prejudice. And in order to do this dialogue today, we couldn't have a better guest speaker for the third critical dialogue on reconciliation than Thania Paffenholz. Thania is the director of Inclusive Peace, a Geneva-based think and do tank operation globally in support of peace processes. Thania has 30 years of experience, both as an academic, as a policy practice advisor. Thania has previously been the director of the Center for Peacebuilding at Swiss Peace in Bern, and served as a peace-building officer at the delegation of the European Commission in Kenya, working on the peace process in Somalia between 1996 and 2000, and supported more than 20 peace processes since then. From 1992 to 1996, she was also research fellow at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. Thania has worked on and in support of peace and political transitions worldwide, has focused on mediation and peace building, inclusion and participation, as well as conditions under which peace processes could produce sustainable outcomes. Thania has received the prestigious Wee Wuri International Prize in 2015, and she has roots in Europe, Africa, and Asia, and is the mother of 2 children. Finally, Thania has published 2 seminal books, both by Lion Rinner, one called Civil Society and Peacebuilding, a Critical Assessment in 2010, and another one called Peacebuilding, a Field Guide, published in 2000, and a really important study on making women count, which was published by Inclusive Peace and Transition Initiative, the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, and the UN Woman in 2016. Before we start this incredible dialogue with Thania, which I'm really extremely grateful to have accepted this invitation, I just wanna share with all of you who have accepted this invitation, the flexible structure of today's dialogue. And I say flexible because, of course, we can move around these things together. This is a dialogue, which means that this is a space to think together. It's not a seminar. The idea is that in this space, we want to hear your comments, your thoughts, your questions, and they can be work in progress. And what we want to do is navigate together to see if we can get at the end of this hour and a half to a point in which we both share similar concerns and have lots of food for continued thinking about reconciliation. So the way how we're going to do this is we are going to first have probably 25 to 30 minutes of Thania sharing her ideas about perpetual peace building in a dialogue with me. Please, during that time, we ask you to not drop questions or comments on the chat, but to allow your own thought process to flow and evolve. Then I will open a collective dialogue for 45 minutes. This collective dialogue would be, in this moment, we will invite you to turn on your camera and to voice your comments, thoughts, questions. We will let your ideas intermingle and flow for a while, and then we will get back to Thania for a couple of times for her to add her own ideas to this dialogue. At the end of it, what I would do is to do a final wrapping up of 5 minutes, and then probably try to collect some thoughts and ideas that have been shared here and connecting them to previous dialogues. The first one that we had on failed reconciliation by Roddy Brett of the University of Bristol, and then by Berta Fries, who was in the second dialogue on transformative encounters for reconciliation. So with that in mind, I would just want to start then this dialogue with Thania. Thania, thank you again for being here. And why don't we start this dialogue with you sharing us a bit the basic idea around this incredible concept that you have written an article that was just published, I believe 3 weeks ago, in the Journal of Transitions and Peacebuilding. And so what is this idea of perpetual peacebuilding, and how is it connected with the challenges for reconciliation?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And thank you, really, everybody. I'm very excited to be with you. And it's also the first time for me to discuss the concept outside of a purely academic space. Yeah, it was published I think last week, actually. But yeah, what is perpetual peacebuilding? I think let me start by why I have felt the need to develop like a new peacebuilding paradigm, as I call it. And this was because both as an academic and a practitioner, I have been observing and working and studying in so many conflicts and peace processes over the years. And I felt we are really stuck. I mean, I started working in the early 90s, and there we were just in this euphoria of, okay, now the Cold War is over, we can fix everything. It's just the political will is there. And there, this concept of basically having an outside mediator, inviting two parties, usually two, to the table, and you basically have an agreement, and with all the recognition, how hard it is to get to an agreement, then you implement the agreement, you kind of also reconcile along the way, and then there is kind of heaven on earth. And then it's not the case. So what we have seen then is that there's really good evidence now, if you look at those peace processes of the early 90s, that none of those peace processes has basically produced peace. Some of them have produced non-violence. Look at maybe Namibia, but few of the places have really produced what we would call a slight sort of approximation of positive peace. So, and then of course, if we jump now to the sort of our ongoing conflicts, look at Syria, look at Afghanistan, look at Yemen, look at all these conflicts, we find like there's no sustainable solution. So something must be entirely wrong with the way the international community is approaching peacemaking and peace building. So, and then we had this other trend in the, I'd say, mid-90s, 2000s to say local is beautiful. Let me say it like that. Everything that's local is now the alternative to the sort of top level that doesn't function. And meanwhile, we also know that's also not it, because you can't isolate the local peace processes and local reconciliation from sort of the top. I have seen, for example, in Somalia, tremendous local reconciliation efforts. The moment the top has decided to smash them, it was all gone. So there needs to be a combination. So all this and the study of sort of recent processes that looked over, let's say 20 years back, really brought me to the thinking like, what is it, what we can do differently? And then in the, I think like since 5, 6, 7 years, it's very prominent to talk about inclusion, civil society need to be there, women need to be there. And we have been at Inclusive Peace quite active in supporting these sort of, let's call it alternative designs for peace processes. And what we have seen in the processes, you have some adaptations. There are suddenly civil society consultations. You had them in Colombia as well. You have civil society kind of support rooms. You have all this. But do we really see a change? So basically, we have added more players to the system, but we haven't changed the play. So in thinking all this, I've tried, first of all, to see what is a realistic approach. And I think I was also quite influenced by what has happened in Syria, where I felt in the Syria process, the international community has basically said, here is Geneva, the Geneva peace talks, and you know, they have hardly happened. I think the parties met once and they didn't even talk to each other. But there was some nice women in the background picture to show basically, oh, there's more actors. But what we have seen is there has not been any negotiation, but for 10 years now, we're talking about the Geneva process. There is no process. So how come that the international community completely ignores the realities on the ground, but has a mantra of this is the way it should be? And so this brought me to sort of the understanding it's just not working. So what is the reality of peace processes then? And if you look then back, you can take any country in the world and say, what has really happened over time? And then what we see is that, and that's what for me the essence of the perpetual peacebuilding concept is, that we have a constant negotiation and renegotiation of the social and political contract. What I mean with that is that over time, take a country like Afghanistan in 2001, we could even go earlier, but let's start 2001. We had basically the US invasion and the Taliban got sort of kicked out. You had the Bonn peace process. Then you had the lawyer Jirga, then you had the constitution making process. And each of those processes, the political contract was renegotiated. Now we have, again, the inter-Afghan talks that, by the way, just collapsed. And the inter-Afghan talks were again, like 20 years later, another attempt to renegotiate the contract, this time with the Taliban. Because in 2001, they were excluded. 20 years later, there was no way out. You had to include them. But it goes further than that. So what I'm saying, basically, it's this constant renegotiation, and give you some features as well. If that's the case, there is no success and failure, because you mentioned the last conversation about failed reconciliation. In an understanding of perpetual peace, there's no failure and success. What there is progress and setback on the pathway to an inclusive, peaceful society. And the inclusive, peaceful society remains an utopian concept, because look at the US, look at France. As we speak, the social and political contract, again, is up for negotiation. So Black Lives Matters movement, for example, what is now the role of a more inclusive society in the US is again, we have to discuss it again. So that means it's also not just a concept for the so-called conflict countries, but it's also a concept for all countries in the world, and that means the terms we are using in our field, like, are we really talking about peace processes? Or can a change also come through a major political reform? Or can it come through a constitutional review? Or. So I'm saying perpetual in the word means it always comes back. So if a process basically fails in the sort of traditional understanding of failure, then you might have a major setback. In Afghanistan, we don't know whether the inter-Afghan peace talk could be revitalized now before the troops leave the country. But eventually, one day, there are going to be renegotiations of the same things that will come up, and they might be enriched with others. So it's this perpetual notion of the processes, which I think is the reality we are facing, which doesn't answer the question yet, what we do then. Let me stop here.
Thania, thank you so much. And I guess what I want to ask you now, I'm going to start taking you slightly off your article, but I think because of some of the things that you have shared, they resonate with Colombia. I know that you are quite familiar with Colombia. And then in Colombia, when we lost the peace referendum, there was a sense that we have failed somehow, that the peace process had failed, and then a renegotiation sort of had to take place, and that renegotiation had a very serious impact on some of the terms of the peace agreement. So I guess from your experience in Colombia, how could you use this concept of perpetual peace building to help the people in the audience who are from Colombia to understand the complex process of building peace in Colombia, in particular in this moment in which many people feel that somehow the peace process or the peace building efforts are failing, and that even in the last Embrace Dialogue Academia seminar that Gwen chaired at the University of Oxford, we had Professor Francisco Gutierrez Anin presenting his book, in which he says that a new cycle of violence is starting in Colombia. So could we say that when you think about perpetual peace building, the peace building could take place amidst the ongoing violence? And so how can you help us understand a bit better Colombia with this framework that you're offering us?
Surprise attack from your end. Okay, let me try. Maybe I go back to the time before the referendum. Actually, we were quite active in Colombia at the time, very much behind the scene, and we haven't really publicly talked about it. And at the time, we were talking actually to the Office of the President about an assessment. So we were asked to look into comparative evidence on referenda. And what we did is we compared success and failure, basically rates of referendum, and then compared it to the Colombia situation. And the result of that was that we said this referendum is highly likely to be lost. Actually, the government got pretty mad at us, and also the civil society peace organizations got pretty mad at us and said, that's not true, it's not going to fail. And we said, we don't know whether it's going to fail. We just say that the conditions are not looking in a direction that it could. So at the time, then they exchanged the information officer and minister, which we also thought was maybe not a clever move. So what happened then? The referendum failed, as we know. And we were then asked to come in again and say, so what next? So what we try to do is find out comparatively from the comparative evidence, what do we know in what happens after failed referendums? And actually the evidence was quite frustrating, because in all failed referenda, it took at minimum 10 years to revitalize the peace process. So what we said at the time to the government is, you can't wait for 10 years. So let's look at different evidence from like failed negotiations and take some conclusions. So our advice at the time was renegotiation. You need to go back and renegotiate now with the opposition, basically to make the peace process alive. And we also talked to a lot of civil movements to say, you need to be out there in the streets and show that maybe there's different opinions in the country, but the peace process is not dead. So this was at the time. So if we now, the trajectory of the process, in a way, it was quite, I would say, predictable that the moment you have a change in government, that sort of the implementation would not go as smoothly as predicted. On top of it, of course, if we look at the Paz Territorial and all the sort of conditions on the ground, I think it is very clear, and here comes, I think, reconciliation in. So when you have a peace agreement, you're still far away from reconciliation. And at the same time, you have multiple problems. You have the armed groups that are not all of them disarmed. You have a peace that has been agreed in Colombia to be sequential, yeah, with one armed group after the other. And so you always have something ongoing, and you always have new conflict. So what does this mean? From a perpetual peace building perspective, overall, it means there is setbacks, as I said, and there's progress. So can you have setback and progress at the same time? I would say absolutely yes, because we are the perpetual peace building concept is basically the counter concept to a linear process. So you would have in Colombia probably a kind of political overall climate that is also, let's say, not perfectly conducive, but that might also change at some time. But you also have many different pockets of peace on the ground, and you can like build from them. But it also means when you are in a time in a peace process where the peace process is basically either stuck or slow or has sort of, let's call it, less conducive environment, it doesn't mean to stop. What it means is to reorient your action, to think about who you are. Are you government? Are you opposition? Are you the religious community? Are you civil society? Whoever you are, it means you need to find out what's your best role to basically contribute in this time to keep sort of, I would say, some energy alive for the process, but at the same time get prepared when the conditions are more ripe, I call them critical junctures, when the next sort of bigger critical juncture comes, can be an election, can be anything else in the country. You can think about how you can create sort of more energy for these critical junctures to come, and what could be those conditions. And that could be a process where single actors reflect about it, but it could be also a collective process of multiple actors to think, what more is it that we can do? And if you feel there's not more we can do, keep on going what you have and basically prepare for the next crucial moment, critical juncture, to then basically make another jump in the process.
It's fantastic. Makes me think about this idea that I've been sharing for a while, and that I'm still writing 2 articles that I hope one day get published, on the idea that when we think about Colombia, we have to understand that there are 2 processes unfolding at the same time. On the one hand, we have fragmented peace that is made of those peace pockets that you are talking about, and that peace was fragmented after the peace referendum, and is evolving alongside what I call a post-truth war. So a war that involves social media, fake news, but is also linked to very serious kinetic actions on the ground. So air bombing campaigns, air spraying against coca crops, and all of these sort of things. So really, in a way, this idea that, you need to think that amidst of violence, you can do peace building it really resonates with this thinking that I have been putting forward for a while. And I guess, thinking about this, I would like to ask you to reflect a bit on this, of the importance of dialogue on these critical conjunctures that you talk about, because I guess that's a really fantastic way to be expecting for the next great opportunity in the future. So you continue doing the work that you need to do with all the restricted space that you have. And then once the great next big opportunity comes, then you act. But so what is the role? And I'm thinking a bit about what you share in your article, the case of Kenya, where you talk about the dialogue ecosystem, this multiplicity of dialogues that are taking place that are not dominated by the government. So could you explain a bit more of the role of dialogue on perpetual peace building and the link to reconciliation?
All right. I mean, first of all, when you say about Colombia, I wanted to highlight what happens psychologically, I think, with all of us being involved and being embedded in a process, is that you get very frustrated when the process is not moving. And I think this frustration takes a lot of energy away. And here, in my view, the perpetual peace building helps also to see into the future and know that history is on your side. Historical evidence is on your side. There has never been a process that was stuck forever. If you look in countries that have moved further away, look at the country Switzerland, where inclusive peace is based. It had a few hundred years ago a very bloody religious war, and Switzerland 100 years ago, a lot of people don't know that, have sent their children. A lot of children of farmers were sent abroad because they couldn't feed their children, and now it's a very small, rich country. So what it doesn't mean that there are no conflicts. Yeah, we just had, with the last elections, we had more women in parliament than before. It was just like really, problematic how little women in parliament. There's a lot of anti-migration politics going on. So we have to keep on going. But how is this then linked, as you say, to reconciliation? Reconciliation, in my view, is like, I personally, and you can then bash me later, I find it a highly problematic concept. Because on the one hand, if you work not only in Christian countries, it's often connotated as a Christian concept. That's one thing, what I hear a lot. And I think Simon is also on the call, Simon Keys, and we are reflecting a lot with him. And I think Simon has developed a lot of interesting categories, but that he developed so many categories, what reconciliation is, shows you also it's a very contested and also blurred concept. So I think for me, the first thing is, if you ask me what it has to do with reconciliation, we have to later open up and ask everybody, because it means, what does reconciliation mean for us, for me? For me, reconciliation vis-a-vis peace building means it goes deeper, because in a peace building scenario, or let's say conflict scenario, conflict management scenario, you could also say we can live together in peace. When I was in Rwanda, for example, people said, there's no way we will ever reconcile. We have no, and even people from religious background who have the Bible as their guiding principle would say reconciliation is not an option. But what is an option is live together in peace. That is an option, yeah, coexistence. So what is then the level of reconciliation where you really go deeper? The first question is, who should reconcile with whom? Are we talking about political reconciliation in Colombia of the government and the opposition? Are we talking about conflict-affected communities reconciling with perpetrators? So I think it's the complexity of who should reconcile with whom about what that needs to be clarified. So in a perpetual peace-building understanding, in my view, these are all sub-dimensions of sort of multiplicity of challenges that have to be addressed with one overarching goal. And that is, how do we come closer to create inclusive, peaceful, and just societies? And that means it will never stop to create, it's never ending. As I mentioned, the example of the US, it's not ending. For some people, they live in a very unjust society in the US, so it's not stopping. There's always something you need to fight for. But the question is, what is it what we do as peace builders and reconcilers? Do we limit ourselves to sort of the big picture, or do we dive into the small things? The problem is, maybe let me finalize with that one. What I have seen in many reconciliation efforts on the ground is what I mentioned earlier, is that people can do these tremendous things on the ground, and they can reconcile, they can really reconcile in a deeper sense, yeah? And you could also go deeper and say it's also a spiritual concept of going. And I liked your 6 principles, which I actually want to add a 7th. I cannot come to that, but it's also the self-critical, where the self connects to sort of a higher being and say, I'm reconciling with myself. So I can help reconcile society. So I think it depends really, where do we want to go? And that means, where do we put our attention in the very moment? So what's my role as a peace builder and reconciler this moment, and what I can contribute best? And that would then be your perpetual peace building contribution to reconciliation. That's how I see it.
Great, Thania. I guess I'm going to ask a final question, but I would like to ask people to start writing their names down in the chat or putting their hands up, so that I can know who would like to kick us off with some ideas, thoughts, or questions to now join into this collective dialogue. So please start thinking about what you would like to share with all of us, and please write your name down or put your hand up so that I can give you a chance to intervene. But Thania, I'd like to pick on something that you said, that is, there is an incredible amount of reconciliation work that happens on the ground. But in the last 2 dialogues that we did, one topic that came up constantly was the problem of scaling it up, because there are incredible efforts done by, let's say, Berta Fries in Colombia, bringing together former members of the FARC with the victims of some of the terrorist attacks that they did, or bringing former members of the army and trying to, heal the wounds of the past by helping them to meet members of the FARC. So, like the 2 combatants. But these are small efforts because, of course, the state, in the case of Colombia at least, or the Colombian government, is quite against the whole idea of the peace agreement. I mean, we could say, like, at least is not as supportive as the previous government, because it won the elections with the idea of reforming the peace agreement. And so how do you scale it up in the thinking in terms of this perpetual peace building? Is that the horizon? Thinking in terms of the next step, and how can we get out of this really serious challenge of stay at the local level and not being able to bring about national reconciliation, even if it is an aspiration?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think I spent probably the last 20 years thinking about it because I've seen so many processes where you had these, like, let's call them really beautiful and effective projects, initiatives on the ground. And then you see basically two problems. One is how do you scale what you said, but the other one is how to protect them also from being taken over, because that's another issue, because we are talking, the word we haven't used yet is power. So it's all about power. And so who has the power to do what? And what we have seen is in many small sort of efforts, they are not scalable because the top is not ready to absorb. That's one thing. So I think, so there are different approaches to go about it, but of course they're very contextual. One is, of course, in the perpetual peace building idea is to push for the next critical juncture in Colombia to see when the top is more receptive. So how can you create more awareness? How can you push the political actors and make an understanding of that this is sort of is an issue that needs to be scaled? For example, if you talk about bringing combatants together with victims and these kind of things, that could be a government policy to do that and part of implementation. So how do you make a sort of attraction for it that this can happen? So how do you also, this means practically speaking, if you have, let's say, 20 projects on the ground like that, can they build in an advocacy component that also has a joint advocacy towards this issue? I'm sure there's a lot already happening, but what we see often is that the advocacy is disconnected from the people doing the work on the ground. So how can you combine that? How can you mobilize the students? How can you get the young people in that basically create this awareness with the next generation? You mentioned that you're also doing work in schools and this is the future. How can you get the churches in? And I know we have worked a lot with the Catholic Church on social cohesion in Colombia, and they said they felt almost like that they haven't addressed it really. So could you revitalize a cooperation with the Catholic Church, as it is the biggest at the moment at least, to go back to the diocese level and say, how can you leverage on the diocese level reconciliation and then scale it up through the political channels that are there? So I think these are just a couple of examples, but I think there is many possibilities to think how we can connect kind of vertically and also horizontal in a way that you can scale. You can't usually achieve everything. So you also need to set priorities. So in this government at this time, what is it? What is maybe the most effort you can do in terms of connect and scale? And what is it what you can already prepare for the next critical juncture to come? So your campaign or your activities are already developed in a way that they can right away take sort of get energy when the moment comes.
Thanks, Thania. That's lots of food for thought. I know that we will have many ideas. I see that already 2 people want to start thinking with us. So let's start this round of thinking together with Camilo, and then Gwen, and please the rest of the people, could you please start writing your name down so that we get a good bunch of people's ideas on the table. Thank you, Camilo.
Thank you, Thania, for your presentation. I think it's a very good moment to listen to it and to remind oneself that these processes are linear and that there is no success, particularly as the moment we're living in Colombia. I wanted to go back to the idea of reconciliation and your criticism to reconciliation, and to ask about time and reconciliation. Because particularly there's now an idea that what we need to do to solve the social problem in Colombia is sort of a fast-track reconciliation where we can hug policemen and and that's basically the end of the problem. And what we've learned with talking to people who on the ground actually work in reconciliation end up saying is you require time and you require changes in the way different people understand life for reconciliation. So how do you see that link between peace building, time, and reconciliation?
Camilo, before I move on to Gwen, could I ask you to introduce yourself so that people know what you do and where you're speaking from?
Sorry, my name is Camilo Villarreal. I'm from Bogota. I'm a law student, and I'm part of Renuncia al Diálogo.
Brilliant. Thanks, Camilo. Okay, Gwen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Thania. It's really interesting to hear your talk, and also really fascinating to hear your behind-the-scenes gossip about your advising of the Colombian government. I would love to hear more about that, but I won't ask about that here because I think that the dialogue is going in a different direction. Yeah, I have a question about polarization and peace building in the midst of polarization. Of course, I'm thinking from the Colombian context, and it's extremely it's very heartening in some ways to hear you talk about how normal it is to feel frustrated in the context of a country where things keep seeming to go wrong. And I think one of the challenges to peace building initiatives at the moment in Colombia is the national level political polarization, which makes it very difficult to talk about peace because peace was an electoral issue. It was a stupid idea to hold a referendum. I wish Santos had taken your advice. But by holding a referendum, it became a much more political issue than it needed to be. And that has had terrible effects, which means that it's harder to continue talking about it even today, many years later. And I think I wonder if that's always the case, because in every country there are electoral cycles, and so there's always polarization in some ways exists in every single country all the way, all the time. I mean, it's a kind of normality of democracy. Democracy is about competition between political groups who are trying to convince the public to vote for them, and it's about power, and that is the normal status quo of a democracy. But in particular, it's difficult to have a country that's trying to do peace building beset by polarization. And I mean, I think that your concept of perpetual peace building is very salient to this issue, but it does sometimes feel like we're going backwards and forwards at the same time, which is a very strange sensation because we are moving forwards. And I think that that's also an important point to raise, that there are amazing initiatives that are happening in Colombia in pockets, as you say. So I just would love to know if you had any thoughts on the relationship between polarization and peace building.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gwen. Lots of also food for thought there. Can I, since Thania has mentioned Simon Keyes, I'm going to give the chance to Simon to also offer his thoughts on some of the comments that Thania has made on reconciliation. So Simon, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, Thania. It's great to see you again. I'm afraid I've not read your paper yet, but actually that was, I found that the idea that you've presented really electrifying, really important contribution to the field, because I think there's a wider move away from the idea of thinking in terms of linear reconciliation processes to much more three-dimensional kind of web type networking, alliance, adaptive approaches. So I think you've caught the mood really well with this idea. And I think particularly you'll focus on things like critical moments, critical junctures, peace pockets, and kind of the evolving network of alliances being the way to create more sustainable approach to peace. I'm absolutely on board with that. Really good. I'm looking forward to reading the paper. One of the things that occurs to me is I've been uncomfortable, I'm sure like you, I've been uncomfortable with linear peace building models for a long time. They often strike me as incredibly naive. Partly because they they rely on predetermined goals, reaching of predetermined goals. Which are often set despite the obvious complexity of conflict. And I mean, one of the villains of the piece here, I think, is the notion of theories of change, particularly as it's been used by governments and by funders to constrain reconciliation and peace building initiatives in a kind of mechanistic straitjacket, if you like. And I'm just wondering, do we need to let go of the concept of theories of change if we are to be successful at perpetual peace building?
Great, thank you, Simon. I guess I have seen that other people want to ask questions, but we're gonna try to go back to Thania now for her to reflect on some of these ideas, lots of food for thought, and then we will go back to another round of thinking together. So just to say, for those of you who didn't know, Simon is at the Winchester Center for Reconciliation and Peace, and Gwen is a junior research fellow at Merton College, University of Oxford. So for people to know who we're talking to, and I ask the next people who are going to speak to also introduce themselves, please. Thania, over to you. You don't have to answer the questions, like that, but let's think together with these ideas that have been put on the table.
Yeah, so I mean, I tried to combine the polarization. I think we wouldn't have any conflict if there wouldn't be polarization. That's the frustrating truth. But we see this more and more, that we have these like two-side polarization in societies, and that's why it makes it so difficult to. It's not only the electoral cycle. So the electoral cycle basically aggravates the problem. And I think the particular problem in Colombia at the time, and maybe also in the future, has been, contrary to other countries, that the word peace has been politicized, because the strategy of the government to kind of win the election with a peace ticket, it has made peace a kind of politicized concept. And I think what is needed in Colombia is to revamp peace and reconciliation as not politicized concept, but as a goal for the entire country. But then peace, and both peace and reconciliation, are, in my view, far too generic. So that means, what is it, how you could unite people from different political spectrums over maybe a new vision. What is this future Colombia that we all want? In Kenya, we say, like, it's the Kenya we want. It's Kenya Tutakayo in Swahili, where since the 90s, this has been an issue, and people say, oh, but we still don't have it. It's true. But the point is, can you create a common vision for the Colombia you want that is beyond the polarization, and say, yes, fine, we can have different opinions, but we don't have to always fight about it and kill each other and whatsoever. But this, I think this development of what this whole idea of conflict transformation is, keep your conflicts, live with them, but kind of don't live with them in a violent way and in a disrespectful way. So I think that's one thing. But the other thing is what I see a lot with peace organizations, when I work with peace organizations, and that was the same when I worked with peace organizations in Colombia, there is a tendency to, you might not like that, but to work with the converted. So I group all my friends and the people that have my same opinions, because how could the referendum fail and the peace community thought it will not fail? Because they were surrounding themselves with like-minded people. And that's also something we see, we have done in the civil society research you mentioned. We've done a lot of research in a number of countries about social cohesion projects, yeah? And so reconciliation projects, and here it links to Simon's theory of change, because I'm fully with you. We need to completely, I'd say, reflect about the way we use theories of change. I'm not sure whether we have to completely abolish, but the way they are used in project two. Particular reconciliation projects. So we have, let's say, a social cohesion reconciliation project that wants to bring two sides together, whoever those two sides are, yeah? Can be as we said, you mentioned as examples, ex-FARC soldiers with victims or whatever. We bring them together. So what happens in most of the projects, you bring them together, you make, you create this atmosphere that they can kind of heal. And then at the end of the workshop, you make kind of an assessment that would say, how do you feel now? And then people say, oh yeah, we feel much better. We really like that person. We have now understood the other and all this. So this very much ignores the context where people come from, in a way that what we have seen in a lot of research studies, that people usually talk to the converted. So you talk to those FARC people that are already very moderate and they are ready for reconciliation. And we could prove that in other contexts with doing surveys and questionnaires before the dialogue started, where people, and you ask people, are you interested in dialogue? Are you against dialogue? And 95% of all people who joined dialogue projects were ready for dialogue. That really shows. And then if you use a control group, that is a random control group, people were mostly against dialogue. So this really shows also mostly these kind of projects preach to the converted. Hence, they get this kind of nice outcome of people feel better. Then take the other example, Israel-Palestine, as it was just sadly up to date. It's probably the country with most reconciliation projects ever funded in the world after the Oslo Agreement 20 years ago. And you think like, how come? And there's still no reconciliation. And I think it's fairly simple and sad at the same time that you would see that the individual changes. The individual has a positive attitude to the other individual, but society around these individuals and even their families, they don't change because the overall political climate of polarization doesn't change. So that means you cannot do these projects in a vacuum of ignoring the overall context and also not just preaching to the converted. I think that's my main message. Last point on theories of change. I thought really a lot about it, but I have really seen that what struck me most, and I'm not naming the organization, there are even guidebooks for how to develop theories of change in the peacebuilding field. And in my view, that's almost, some of them is almost absurd because it shows you, these are the main peace building goals, and this is how you develop your theory, which means you completely disconnect context from objectives. And that's what I see a lot in the field, that I see very different contexts, but they're all the same projects. Whether in Colombia or in Myanmar or in Bosnia, we see the same projects. How come? It is because there are these ready-made theories of change that says, okay, I'm doing training in this and this, I apply it, I do a brilliant context analysis, and that's really true. Context analysis have improved in the last 20 years tremendously. But if you look at context analysis and then look into what projects come out, there's a disconnect between the context because of the theories of change that are all the same.
I've seen that, Thania, that's fantastic. And to the extent that Simon is eager to talk. So, and as I know that is a direct comment to you, I'm going to give the chance to Simon to talk first, and then I'm going to go to Caroline Brooks, and then please, the rest of the people who have some ideas, feelings, thoughts, questions, just please drop your name or raise your hand. It would be amazing for you to contribute to this dialogue. Simon.
What's going through my mind as you speak, Thania, and this is so stimulating, it's wonderful, is I'm wondering if there's another fault at the heart of peace building, which is an over-attachment to the idea of consensus, that somehow peacemaking is only possible if people agree. And you've only got to look at the long-standing intractable conflicts and the ones you just mentioned, for instance, all those hundreds of peace building initiatives in Israel-Palestine, some of which I know and have huge affection for, and have this awful feeling that it's just not achieved anything. People's whole lives have not achieved anything. And I think it's because they've tried to work on the basis of trying to get people to agree and to promote mutual understanding, as if somehow that will create bridges between people. And I've been very kind of provoked by the work of Oliver Ransbottom recently on looking, based largely, I think, on his detailed and extensive time spent in Israel-Palestine, recognizing that that philosophy is not going to work. With people who are such bitter enemies, where you have such an intractable conflict and you have such a fundamental conflict of power, land, all those things. And he's been developing ideas really about different types of dialogue, an agonistic form of dialogue that isn't about looking for agreements or common ground or even mutual understanding of adversarial positions, but it's about trying to explore the nature of the conflict itself in all its dirty, rude, passionate intensity. And he talks about that kind of dialogue being the Wild West of peace building. It's a great phrase. And so I'm just wondering whether part of this rethinking of perpetual peace building is about challenging some of our deeper assumptions that peace building is about consensus, building alliances with people with mutual interest, and whether it might not be more concerned with kind of Chantal Mouffe's type approach to a really agonistic approach to politics, but which somehow takes the violence out of the political struggle, but doesn't actually in any way underestimate or deny the reality of the struggle.
And with that Simon has said, I think I want to bring back a question that I asked you that probably was left aside and connected with what Camilo said that probably adds to the topics that we're discussing now. This idea, what is the role of dialogue, whether agonistic or not? What is the role of dialogue in perpetual peace building? And whether when we are thinking in terms of dialogical complex processes like agonistic dialogue, we can also start thinking the times of reconciliation instead of short-term solutions, long-term slow processes that intensify in different moments. And because that was the concern of Camilo, what is the timing of reconciliation and how to deal with that? Mm-hmm. Probably perpetual peace building can help with that, but I'm just thinking here aloud. With that in mind, let's go to Caroline Brooks. Caroline, over to you. Please introduce yourself and make your comment, question, or share your feelings.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. It's really great to be with you and to have the opportunity to talk to you all in this format. I am a Syria program manager at International Alert. So this is really great food for thought and sparking lots of things of recognition about what's happening there, and also great to be able to build on some of these great ideas and conversations. My question is around what you see as the role of collective emotions and collective trauma in the model of perpetual peace, and whether that was considered as a sub-dimension along with things like reconciliation and the other sub-dimensions that you alluded to earlier. So any sort of thoughts or reflections around that, how you've seen it showing up in the process, yeah, just wanted to put that onto the table as well. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Caroline. That's amazing. And I see that Andrew Ashdown has written something in the chat and saying that he really enjoys the comments by Simon and by Thania. I wonder, Andrew, whether you would like to say something else to the forum that we have here. You're very welcome to speak to the audience.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I'm Andrew. I'm out of Winchester University. I just had a PhD in 2019 on Christian-Muslim relations in Syria. Done a lot of work in Syria. I'm working now for a charitable international agency on advocacy, and I'm working closely with Myanmar, Nagorno-Karabakh, Syria, Nigeria, and various other places. So this is echoing hugely. I think I just want to echo really what Simon and Thania are saying. This principle of the idea of coming to agreement is almost, is just pie in the sky. But one has to move forward, and dialogue and the need to engage with all parties is very important, and the need to embrace the realities on the ground and differing opinions and differing views. I'm in my job and in the work that I'm doing, I'm grappling constantly with that issue. And also another point that came across, which I think is a very important one, is this issue of networks, and that's what we're also doing, much more engaging with wider networks, and the networks on the ground, the networks beyond, but always with an eye to the real context and making those links between the people on the ground and the theories we try to present, but never underestimating the complexity and the difference. Sorry, I'm not making any hugely new statements or anything of great contribution, but I really want to affirm what's being said here, and would never want to underestimate the difficulty in it. But I don't think there's ever any easy way at all.
Fantastic, Andrew. I mean, this is the idea, to share ideas together and to revisit some issues. So, Thania, over to you for another round of thoughts and ideas after what you have heard so far in this round of thinking together.
Yes, very stimulating. And I probably have to disappoint Caroline. Haven't thought about it, but that's good in the sense, like, so I've developed the concept, I put it out. It's this article I produced, and I think what I would like to do as a next step is really to further develop it with field testing. So to really invite you all to say, how can we do comparative case study research to say, what would that mean? So I think we are pretty good in, historically, we can go back and can say, somebody mentioned Myanmar. That's why let me take that as an example. We can now historically go back in Myanmar and other cases, and we can systematically, that's what I do in the article with Kenya, identify the critical junctures that happen in the country, and then discuss what change happened or not in that very critical juncture, and how did it manifest? Did it manifest as a formal peace process? Did it manifest as a constitution process? Did it manifest as a military coup? So what was it? But it was a major event that's changed the game in the country. So then we can analyze that. But then what next? What are we doing with that knowledge that we are gaining? So how do we move from the analysis of the historical junctures to what do we learn from this? And this, I would really like to have a bigger collective project that we can work with different universities. And I really would like to invite you all to join that. And for Myanmar, what would it mean when you have, I mean, in a simplistic way, you could say, it is very clear that history again will repeat each other, and that this military coup will definitely not stay forever. So this is, on a conceptual, theoretical point, it's easy to say. The problem is emotionally what you tell these people who are on the street and resisting. Are you telling them, just wait, no worries, you're gonna get basically democracy one day, which is probably evidence-based true. But the point is, how do we help them with evidence we have to say, what does it mean for you now? And how can the you now in Myanmar be supported by the outside community? And I think that's the challenge in terms of how can we encourage activists to protect themselves and at the same time use social media and other assets? How can social media be, or take the example of the opposition, one of the opposition members in Belarus, who was, I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? Who the plane was forced down, and the guy was arrested on a plane from Athens to Vilnius, and without a planned touchdown in. How do we? What do we tell these people? We tell these people that, of course, the fighting and the resistance can't stop, but it also means that there needs to be much more advocacy for the EU and other actors to keep on doing sanctions and statements. So now, what does it mean for dialogue? So I think dialogue, and I fully agree with Simon, there is an obsession in the peacebuilding and reconciliation community that we can solve everything with dialogue. And that's simply not true, because dialogue is one approach to the complexity of moving us in a perpetual peacebuilding way to pathways to peace. If we take the Myanmar example and the example of Belarus, then dialogue is not enough. Dialogue might be at a certain stage an instrument, But at other times, you need advocacy, you need civic movements on the street, and you need to support the civic movements with protection measures, with solidarity, looking at your principles, he said in the beginning, with acknowledgement and respect, and with a lot of advocacy vis-a-vis international actors that they put pressure. And then when the kind of time is ripe, then when does it come? Because if we take Belarus as an example, the question is if really the people of Belarus need any reconciliation. I have my doubts. I rather think that the government needs to be kind of reconciled with itself and with the way it governs. So, which is a very different type of reconciliation. But what the understanding in a traditional peace building approach is, there's some people who just have to come together, and if they only understand each other, the world is perfect. And that's just simply not true, because it's the conditions around and the power relations that need to be addressed. So every single peace building project that doesn't address the existing power relations around, even if you as a peace builder can't do everything, because not everybody can talk to the president of the EU, but others can do it. You can do lobby in the EU Parliament, you can do, you name it. But it's this networking, and I think this is an important aspect. How can you network this ecosystem of different approaches that will bring the push? And how can you also recognize sometimes it's just not the right time? And this answers a little bit this timing question. Sometimes the time is not right and we just have to wait. But waiting doesn't mean in agony, but it means in acknowledging the frustrations we have and turning them into energy and action.
Thanks, Thania. I guess lots of food for thought there. I've seen that I was gonna ask Anna to ask her question loud, but I've seen that you have responded a bit to her. I wonder whether Anna would like to say something in regards to what Thania shared regarding Myanmar, and any thoughts, Anna? Your mic.
Andrea, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, we can hear you now, Anna.
Can you hear me? I've listened to what Thania's been saying. I'm really inspired by her ideas. I didn't really quite gather how she applied those ideas to Myanmar. I mean, we had a project in Myanmar for about 5 years, and I've been writing about what's happened since the coup. Although I agree with Thania that this is a repetition of previous coups, it's really rather different because Myanmar had opened up to the world. There was a new generation who had internet connections, who used those. And at the beginning of the post-coup period, young people, the young generation, even ethnic minorities who've been fighting the government, all came out onto the streets confidently. Women were leading it. And then the violence started. And most recently, there's been violence, return of violence between ethnic groups on the margins. So civil protesters have been supported by people from across Asia. There's been international pressure from the UN, from Western governments, and even from regional governments surrounding Myanmar. But the government, the military government, I don't know how to support. I don't know. I mean, that sounds really rather just as an individual, but I want to know, how Thania would recommend action. What can one do in a situation like this? Sorry, I know that sounds naive, but how do her ideas affect a situation like that, where the government is prepared to use such force, such energy against people civil resistors, who are peaceful? So what can we do
It's a challenging question, but we will see what Thania shares with us. I mean, of course, you know, like you don't need to, but if you have any ideas, that'd be great. Let's go to Jonas, who's also requested the chance to talk and to share his thoughts or ideas or questions with us. So Jonas, over to you. You're muted.
Thank you. This is really an interesting discussion. My name is Jonas Wazi. I am attending right away from Uganda. And Uganda happens to be one of those countries that have been prone to conflict since independence. We have gone through cycles of violence over a period of time. As a result of several coups and changes in government. And one of the parts of Uganda, which is northern Uganda, has experienced conflict for a period of around 23 years under the Lord's Resistance Army. And there were a number of peace-building processes that failed and focus was mainly put on military means to solve that conflict. But beyond that, government has undertaken a number of measures to reconstruct that part of the country that has been ravaged by conflict for almost now coming close to 10 years. Given that context, there are a number of interventions that have been implemented, and all these interventions are mainly based on linear peace-building processes, like colleagues have been saying, without paying much attention to the local needs and the needs of other stakeholders. In light of that, I have two questions. One, the role of the local people in building perpetual peace, as well as what contribution local politicians can do in terms of providing political accountability in building up for perpetual peace. I thank you.
Thanks, Jonas. That's fantastic. Thanks so much for that. So I guess, Thania, over to you for our last round of thinking together. So, you know, take your time to elaborate and to probably, you know, do a wrap up from your part on some of the ideas that have been shared and new ideas that you might have now that we've listened to other people.
Thank you very much. Yeah, let me talk to Anna first. I think I can fully understand the frustration. I actually had the same. It has been, and I also agree with you that this coup is different, as in the period we have seen before was a period of opening. But I think the challenge in Myanmar since the opening has been that there's a triple transition, how I call it, from war to peace, from sort of authoritarian to democracy, but also this tremendous economic transition that has overruled all other transitions with all the power relations and interests that are driven behind. So I think you have a very complex set of transitions, and which is on the one hand normal, on the other hand, it depends how you address them. So the government has then, of course, decided for addressing the armed conflict one by one, kind of, and it has also decided to speed up the economic transition and kind of slow down the democratization transition and keep the control as much as possible. So you have this sort of imbalance between the three transition process speeds. So which means that still what we see is that the government is pretty much in the corner. So I'm not sure whether the government really wanted to get there where it is now. So I think the point is what we often have to do when we talk about let's call it like an enlarged concept of reconciliation, to reconcile also with the idea of that a government does things we don't like, yes, and there is resistance, and everything that you described to support the resistance on the ground, from the outside, from the inside, with protection, with ideas, with connections, with advocacy, that's the right thing to do. But I think what we also need to understand is how can we help the government, and the we is the question, who's the we, but I'm just putting it out, to get out of the corner, because that's a crucial point. The government sits in a corner and has maneuvered itself into that corner. So how can it get out of the corner? Because that's a precondition for the rest to ease up. Is it the pressure that comes from the big neighbors because of their economic interests, or is it other means? So I think reflecting more about how to get the government out of the corner would be an approach, in my view, that has not done so much, because the other approaches we have already seen, and we see that the pressure is only sort of having minimal effect, at least in the short run. But we also know in the long run it will have effects. But how can you speed up the process, so to say, through that? That would be my spontaneous idea. On Uganda, my neighbor country, I'm in Kenya. I think, again, the government has decided, in the complexity of the root causes of the conflict, one of them being the imbalance between the North and the South, to put all efforts into addressing the deprivation, the economic and the conflict-ridden deprivation of the North 10 years ago, as you rightly say. But it has had a very linear approach to economic development and military stability, creating military stability, as you know. And I also agree with you, and has done this sort of sidelined from sort of what local communities maybe wanted, what local politician maybe wanted. So I think the point is to have a dialogue, in this case, in my view, dialogue between kind of the center, as in government in Kampala, and sort of the regions in the north, to see, maybe to have an assessment, like a very, I mean, it's not an easy one, but have a conversation that is maybe starting in a soft way to say, okay, what have we learned from this approach? We have this and this approach, we have achieved this and this and that. There were achievements. There's definitely less violence than there was 10 or 15 years ago. So to engage in a process of a dialogue of assessing the achievements, which then hopefully will also bring out the challenges, and create in a climate with, as you say, the stakeholders on the ground, which is, in my view, a network of local peace builders, local politicians, religious leaders, and others who have local power centers and who will be there to sort of answer in this direction, and bring them together in a dialogue about what have we learned from this approach, where are we, and what more can we do. This is spontaneous idea on Uganda. And in general, I mean, to have, as you said, concluding words from my end, I've learned a lot.
I'm gonna stop you 1 second, because I see that Andrew wants to comment on Myanmar, and I really want to give you the chance to do a final sort of wrapping up. So probably let's listen to Andrew, and if anyone has some final thoughts that they feel that they really want to share, and ideas, a feeling or something, please just write on the chat. Otherwise, we just give the chance to Andrew to comment on Myanmar, and then go back to Thania, and we will close this space of dialogue. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you both Thania and Anna for raising this. I think Myanmar does raise a huge complexity. And I think one of the complexities about Myanmar, and I think I differ with Thania here, is that, of course, the government of Myanmar is the elected government of Myanmar, which has been detained. So the military junta is in power by force. I was speaking with just this morning with the international representative for the National Unity Government, who's the only person representing the government who's outside the country, and pleading with the international community to recognize the National Unity Government, because that is the democratically elected government supported by the vast majority of the people, and therefore, and this is where the difference, taking it onto a wider level, the difficulty between advocacy and actually engaging with governments and government responsibility, because I think that there's a real responsibility for governments here to recognize, to act in certain situations. So I agree with you on one level that we, in dealing with that military junta, which has been in control for so many decades, one has to engage with those people as to how they're going to operate within a new system, and actually, yes, engage with them, but they do not have legitimacy. It's one situation where that country really does not have legitimacy. The international community should not be engaging with a junta that has imprisoned the democratically elected legitimate government, which we should be recognizing, which all the people, the vast majority of the people of the country support. So there's political, so you know, there are various levels, and how we engage academically with the people on the ground, with governments, and the government responsibilities as well, when and how to take action, whilst at the same time engaging with the people we don't like, or the people who have power, whether that's legitimate or not. Don't have any answers there, but there we go. Thank you. Don't want to go on.
First of all, I think we don't disagree. I think I just formulated it not very well, in the sense like the self-elected military government. That's what I meant. And I think it's a very, so I think it's this, what I mean is it's a combination of should, as you say, the international community disengage, should the international community recognize the government? So this is like, what I like to do is you map out what are the opportunities to push the process and what are the resistances and how do you address them. So if we talk about the opportunities, we could make a list and say that could be the recognition issue, the advocacy issue. So you list all the opportunities, and then you will see that a lot of them are already done, but maybe not fully working. Okay, then you resist, and that's what I mean is often missing. You list the resistances, and the resistances to change, let's say, the resistances from the military self-appointed government, or whatever, how they call themselves, is definitely also a reaction of fear, of loss of power, loss of control. They have embedded themselves nicely with their quotas in parliament to still be in control. Suddenly they feel like, oh, this overwhelming election results puts us out of control. So what do? You can also say maybe an overreaction. So how do you address this resistance from them and the fear? Let's also acknowledge that's part of reconciliation, that they are fearful about losing power. So how can they be convinced? And that doesn't mean that this has to be official governments, if they would sort of so the question is again the network of actors. Who can work on that side to reduce the fear and pave a way for the military government to understand they are on a dead end track? Yeah, because there's no way. And I guess if they know that in a way, but they don't know how to get out of there. So how do you address these two in parallel? I think that's what I mean. Final word from my end is I was very excited to have this conversation, and after it, I'm still very excited. And it shows me also that I put out the concept, and I think it's just a mere like overall analysis concept. We really have to still go away and fine-tuning it and telling us like where to go next and what other ideas we can. My challenge, and let me be very honest with you, my challenge is that I have a very clear idea how we can do a research project on critical junctures historically in many countries, and then we will probably end up with similar results. But how do we then move from these analyses to leading us into how can we do things differently? Because the problem is we don't have so much evidence. Because we have evidence how the difference has been on the ground, and we have a few pockets of kind of interesting stories, but we don't have a lot of evidence to study this has been done really different and it worked. So I think we are left with probably, and that's interesting for me, long-term historical studies. Where were these breaking points in many countries that have passed, that are further on the pathway, that we can see what we can learn from those breaking points and ideas and approaches they have taken. And let's say, just one last example, if you talk about more women in peace processes, very popular, as we know, But what really counts is not how many women are in peace processes, but how is the women quota in parliament, and how many how are women treated in a society equally, and how have those, is there a sort of a correlation between the ones in the peace process and in the critical junctures and the one sort of the 50 years later? So going really back and saying, what were these conditions? And how can we then go to Myanmar and to Colombia and to Syria and say, this is what we think could be done differently, but we have no clue if it works. But here is a menu of options. And what we also, in my view, have to be in the peace building, in my view, the perpetual peace building also tells us we should be very humble and we should be critical friends with ideas. But at the end of the day, it's local leadership and national ownership to these processes. We can only, from the outside, we can only provide ideas. From the inside, we can just never ever give up. Thank you.
Thania, thank you so much. I think it's been an absolutely thought-provoking dialogue today. Starting from your challenge, I think that also and being humble, as you suggest, is we can have all the evidence of the world and go to a place and suggest ways of action, but to change behaviors and ways of doing things, it is something completely different. So it is so difficult, even with evidence, to help change patterns of behavior. And I think that's fundamental challenge. Also, and this is the paradox also, when we believe a lot on local peace builders is, well, yeah, local peace builders are also trapped in some particular ways of doing things that at the same time become obstacles for the transformations. So it is incredible that, in this idea of perpetual peace building that you are suggesting is this constant process of revisiting the assumptions and the practices of peace builders, both at the local and at the international level, to try to achieve that is an ideal, as you said, an inclusive and peaceful society. But I think that, like the four things that really stay probably with me and I want to share with everyone before we depart, and, for us to keep in mind, is that perpetual peace building is an invitation to think about change in a different way, in a non-linear way. And I think that's a fantastic contribution, has been done by other academics and practitioners in the field, but it's an invitation to continue doing that and to continue thinking that change is something that happens all the time and that we always have to be ready to take the opportunities that change bring. And that's what perpetual peace building does. The second one is that opens the horizon of time for reconciliation and takes away the urgency of having to do things today, and is linking the today with the tomorrow, with the farther down the line and the critical conjunctures that come into the future, what can help us deal with the third really important element that I think perpetual peace building is bringing to the table, and is to deal with frustration. Because it is true, and I see it, and it probably, some of the members of Rodemos el Diálogo are the living example of how frustrating is to work for peace building in Colombia. And it's heartbreaking, but it's when you think that, perpetual peace building is an ongoing process where you constantly are waiting for the next big opportunity that you can really build up your energy to do that change. And finally, it's connected to this idea that if you do this mapping of complex relations that are constantly changing and these networking opportunities that emerge in the time, is that you can be creative about how to bring peace and to continue working for that horizon that is an aspiration. So with those four ideas, I think I would say that we close this critical dialogue on reconciliation with our thoughts on Colombia. Colombia, as the people who have joined in this space and are working on Colombia, is going through a very complex process of a national strike, the longest in the history of Colombia for the last 50 years. More than 50 activists have been killed in the middle of the national strike. More than 1,500 people have suffered human rights abuses. And I think this was a really timely discussion for those of you who are working on Colombia to think that there are parallel examples in other parts of the world and important concepts that we can use so that we see this as a critical conjuncture that open new opportunities for perpetual peace building. So with that in mind, and if you don't mind, I would like to ask the people who are still in the audience to turn on their cameras and to open their microphones and to give a round of applause to Thania, who is now in Kenya, but who, since we are not in the same space, it's always nice to see the faces of the people and really thank her for giving us this food for thought. So Thania, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And see you all probably in the next Critical Dialogue for Reconciliation. Probably next month you will receive the invitation. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.